Here's a question. What do you think of when I say the word dissonance? It's a pretty simple concept. It's straightforward, and you would think that there's a straightforward and easy answer to what it is. But it turns out that there's no definition of dissonance that can adequately explain what it is and how it works in common practice tonal Western harmony. It is a fundamentally subjective term, but it's so important that it deserves some kind of objective analysis. We have to see what's going on here. While consonance and dissonance do ultimately have their roots in some actual acoustic phenomenon, that is the overtone series, there are 6 different ways of conceptualizing dissonance, and they all agree with one another in certain ways and disagree with the others in other ways. I'm the Classical Nerd, and today we're looking at the different ways we can think about dissonance, and I'm going to offer a pet theory of my own at the end. I'm going to present 6 different ways in which we can think about the concept of dissonance. These are the personal, the cultural, the acoustical, the mathematical, the contrapuntal, and the grammatical. They all have points of overlap and points of disagreement, most notably with the personal and the cultural. What you think of as consonant and dissonant is going to be informed not just by the music of your culture, but by the music of any cultures you've been exposed to for any significant period of time. For instance, when I first started playing Balinese gamelan music, the beating tones, the differences in tuning between pairs of instruments, was something that struck me as very odd and a fascinating sound, but over time I got used to those as sounding stable. Would I call them consonants? Not really. That concept is not really something that you find a lot in other cultures, as I mentioned. But if you think of consonance in terms of stability and dissonance in terms of something away from that stability and that sort of dichotomy, then all of a sudden, yeah, you could say that I started thinking of these dissonant tones that most people would find dissonant as consonances because they were stable, they sounded right. Consonance to Western ears and practices is all about achieving harmonic stability, and dissonance and consonance exist as 2 sides essentially of the same coin. One is tension. That's the dissonance, and then it is resolved in the consonance. And this idea of tension and release is something that you can find across a broader swath of music than just the Western world. If you're looking exclusively within the Western tradition for music that sounds consonant to a certain group of people or to a certain person, look no further than the Armenian composer Aram Khachaturian. I did a video on him not too long ago, and he said that he heard seconds as being as consonant as any actual consonants. It's a pretty fun question to ask. What exactly sounds dissonant to your ears? Drop a comment if you have any ideas. I love nothing more than trying to get inside people's heads and figuring out how they hear things and understand things. Anyway, those are the easy views of dissonance, what you think and what the broader culture thinks, and those, again, are related. But there has to be some way of thinking about this concept that goes beyond just what sounds good or what's treated in a certain way by a certain system or a certain culture. And to that we have to turn to the acoustical definition. The harmonic series generates a series of mathematically precise ratios above the fundamental. Odd numbers give you new notes, while prime numbers give you new ratios. And the further up you go in these partials, the closer together and more dissonant they become. But this conflicts with the cultural. Play the 11th harmonic, and many people will think that it sounds absolutely bizarre. But the 11th harmonic is more dissonant than the 3rd or the 5th harmonics, and the general idea is that things get progressively more dissonant as you move up. So the tritone, as you would find on the piano, is best approximated pretty far up the series. Alternatively, you can consider the tritone to be like the store-brand 11th harmonic. Either way, this goes a long way towards explaining why the tritone sounds like a dissonance. You might think that the mathematical view of dissonance would run along similar lines, and it sort of does, but allow me to present you with the most singularly problematic interval that we're going to be talking about today, and that is the perfect fourth. The perfectly in-tune fourth presents a ratio of 4:3. That is, there are 4 cycles of the upper tone per every 3 that the lower tone has. The mathematical view is very similar to what Harry Partch dealt with, in that intervals with simpler ratios are more consonant than those with more complex ratios, and since the intervals of modern 12-tone equal temperament are all derived from the square root of 2, and they're not really in tune. While Partch's answer was an extension of Pythagorean principles in the form of a custom-built orchestra, the basic principle of dissonance can be extracted, and the perfect fourth, with its very simple 4-to-3 ratio, is one of the simplest you can get, just after the 2-to-1 octave and the 3-to-2 perfect fifth, and of course the 1-to-1 unison, although whether or not the unison is actually an interval is hotly debated. I don't think it is. Now if we go by Paul Hindemith's ideas of relative consonance and dissonance, then these things also exist on a spectrum, with the octave as the most consonant and the tritone as the most dissonant, with all intervals falling somewhere in between. But while Hindemith is informed by the harmonic series, it's still his personal idea of what constitutes dissonance. I find, personally, the minor ninth to be extremely dissonant, more so than the minor second, which should, acoustically, be the same interval. So while Hindemith's idea is more scientifically rigorous, it's still not entirely accurate. But more importantly, where in the world is the perfect fourth in the overtone series? I mean, it's just not here. You have to go further up the list of partials than what's shown here to find it. And so you would think that this is actually a pretty dissonant interval, and yet it's not. The ratio is pretty simple. And sure, you can find it between partials, and that's how Partch found it, but that subverts the whole idea that dissonance increases going up when compared to the fundamental. If you start comparing notes within that series, then the system gets a lot more complex. Now you could say that the perfect fourth is an inversion of the perfect fifth, which is true, and that's the first new ratio we get in the harmonic series. So problem solved, right? Well, not when you look at counterpoint. The contrapuntal conception of dissonance is one that lies at the heart of Western music and how tonal harmony functions even before tonal harmony emerged. The use of dissonance in Renaissance counterpoint was very strictly controlled. The default was all consonants, and if you wanted to use a dissonance, you had to prepare it in a certain way, then the dissonance had to sound, and then you had to resolve it in a certain way. This led eventually to a more harmonic understanding of music in the Baroque era and the codification of the common practice system, or what we mistakenly broadly call music theory. This is the use of the tritone, this very dissonant interval, as the way to get from one chord which was dissonant to another chord and resolve it that way. The tritone is the reason that the 5-to-1 cadence works so well. This tritone, depending on how it's spelled, can resolve either by half steps inward or half steps outward. And this contrary motion of half steps is what gives it that powerful characteristic of something being dissonant and then resolving to something consonant. So you'd think that the perfect fourth, this interval that is purely acoustically and mathematically pure, would be treated as a consonance in this system. But if you look at 16th century counterpoint, the fourth is considered a dissonance. It is handled as such because it resolves by half step to a third. Now there are lots of different ways to tune the third, and the simplest one in just intonation is a 5-to-4 ratio. There are several more complicated ones, but this is giving the third its best shot at competing with the fourth in terms of intervallic purity. And even the 5-to-4 ratio is more complex than a 4-to-3 ratio, which doesn't make any sense. Why would the 5-to-4 be more consonant than the 4-to-3? This is in direct conflict to how the acoustical and mathematical properties I just explained would handle dissonance and try to explain it. And curiously, medieval composers thought of the third as being unstable and they would want to resolve it to the fourth, which actually makes a little bit more sense. So with the fourth, even though it sounds consonant in the abstract, there is still a level of dissonance in it because you want to hear it resolve to the third. Now in common practice tonality, so we're moving outside of the realm of Renaissance counterpoint, this led to the way that second inversion triads are very specifically handled. In the second inversion, the fifth is on the bottom, creating a fourth between the bass and the upper third. And this renders the upper third as a dissonance, which requires resolution, which is the proper handling of the vast majority of 6/4 chords that you're going to see. The idea that these upper tones are dissonant is so prevalent that a significant school of thought within theoretical circles is that a one chord in second inversion cannot and should not be labeled 1/6/4, but instead 5/6/4 to show that it's an embellishment of the 5 chord, even though 2 of the 3 notes of the 5 chord aren't even there. The idea is that it's not really a tonic chord. You can't call it 1 because it doesn't sound like 1. It's dissonant because of its inversion, because that fourth exists between the bass and the next highest note. There is not a single interval in this chord that, from a mathematical perspective, is dissonant, and yet the second inversion triad still is. But there's another chord that falls into this category, and that is the augmented triad. The augmented triad is built by stacking two major thirds on top of one another, which renders an augmented fifth on the outside. This chord contains no objectively dissonant interval. The major third inverts to the minor sixth, but both of these sound consonant. Yet when you put them all together, this is an unstable sound. It wants to go somewhere. Where it can go is determined by how the chord is spelled, and this gets us around to our final look at dissonance, the grammatical look. The reason that this is dissonant is because no matter how you want to spell this chord, there is no way that you can come up with a version that does not have a diminished or augmented interval in there. And even though an augmented fifth by itself doesn't sound dissonant because it's inharmonically equivalent to a minor sixth, the very fact that it's augmented shows us that it's a dissonance and should be treated as such. All diminished and augmented intervals are dissonant. In this spelling, the G sharp wants to move up to the A, and we get an A minor triad in first inversion. But if this were an A flat, you would have a first inversion augmented triad, where the A flat moves down to G. Okay, you might say, this is all well and good, but spelling is looking at music through a very particular lens, and it still does not give us a good solid foundation as to why these chords are dissonant. So it's time for my personal pet theory, which I will admit is not super fleshed out, but it's something that I've noticed, and I think it's something that might be of use and interest to people who are interested in this concept. And this is the idea that dissonance arises as a result of harmonic symmetry. My pet theory is basically an observation that symmetrical chords tend to sound dissonant, and symmetrical constructions have a tendency to sound dissonant regardless of whether or not the compound intervals that those intervals create are themselves dissonances. Major and minor triads have a kind of hierarchy. They're not splitting the perfect fifth into two equal parts. They're unevenly splitting it into minor and major thirds and stacking them in different ways. But if you stack two minor, two major, or two neutral thirds on top of one another, and you get a form of dissonance. Likewise, the tritone splits the octave in exactly half, but break into a fifth and a fourth, and it's super constant. And this is unusual when you compare Western music to Western beauty standards, which prize symmetry. Apparently symmetrical faces are supposed to be super attractive or something. But if you think of music more in terms of a science, which has been considered since medieval times up through the 20th century, and this has more in common with a concept in theoretical physics known as symmetry breaking. And I don't pretend to have a firm grasp on what this is. I'm not a physicist. But as far as I understand it, symmetry breaking is the tendency of different systems, either on a small or large scale, when they're at an equilibrium, there's a tendency for small fluctuations within the system, perhaps even on a quantum level, to tip that in a certain direction or the other, breaking the symmetry of the system in a way that sounds, well, in the case of music, it sounds more consonant. But in the case of, for instance, a Lagrange point out in the middle of space, a small perturbation in this area of stability between two gravitational bodies, and whatever's sitting at that point is going to fly off into space. And there is still room for the overtone series, because if you stack more consonant intervals, they have a tendency to accrue dissonance at a less profound rate. So if you stack a bunch of fourths or fifths, it's not going to sound quite as crunchy as if you stack a bunch of major thirds or minor thirds on top of one another. The idea here is that dissonance is only dissonance if it sounds like it needs resolution. And that's going to be ultimately a personal and unquantifiable thing. You might think that the augmented triad sounds perfectly consonant, and I can't stop you from thinking that way. We've sliced this particular pie 6 different ways, and my own little pet theory is the caramel drizzle on top, and we're still no closer to understanding which of these is best suited for understanding what dissonance is, how it arises, and why it works in the way that it does. The very nature of what dissonance is defies the existence of such a hard and fast rule to cover everything. But it is interesting to talk about.